think I want to start today by thanking the two of you for doing such impressive work in bringing scholars together and discussing various kinds of topics relevant and important to the medical humanities. So what I want to do is to bring up my PowerPoints, and then I'll start from there. And of course, I welcome questions, concerns, any kinds of things that you want to debate. So you can put it in the chat, or you can, of course, raise questions afterwards. So let's see. I think you're able to see the application right now. At least Martha is showing me the right nonverbals. So welcome again to a chat on what I've called Fertile Forever, Reproduction in the Age of Egg and Sperm Freezing. The topic kind of arrived in about 2015 when I was doing some work on sperm cryopreservation or sperm freezing. And I was fortunate enough to get some funding to do a collaborative interdisciplinary project with a legal scholar, a bioethicist, sociologist, and science technology studies scholars on this topic of egg and sperm freezing. And of course, when I refer to freezing, I'm not thinking about the typical kinds of sub-zero temperatures. I'm thinking about the ability to cryopreserve indefinitely, potentially, your reproductive cells. So some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about today is coming out of this book that we wrote together. It's called The Cryopolitics of Reproduction on Ice. And so I'll refer back to that at times throughout my talk today. I want, though, to sort of begin by paying credit to the kinds of scholarship that sort of really has created a platform for us. And it is primarily feminist scholarship. It is primarily scholarship within the humanities and social sciences. And it's scholarship that has critically looked at the idea of reproduction, as well as the notion of preserving reproduction for later use. So it is, for example, feminist perspectives on temporality, what happens and how can we grasp the idea that we can postpone fertility for a later time, for example. How does freezing give us new forms of reproductive temporalities that young women and increasingly young men as well will have to negotiate and think about. It's also scholarship that looks at the idea of reproduction critically from the perspective of what might be referred to as the naturalization of genetic relatedness. That is, that we think about kinship when we freeze reproductive cells in rather traditional ways, right? I mean, we are sort of, in a sense, stuck, or we're frozen in the understanding that having children involves carrying out, proceeding with our own genetic material, right? So the drive towards reproductive freezing is very much a drive that evolves around the idea and desire of an own baby or an own child. Another set of perspectives that sort of we build upon and that I especially have built upon is the sort of more sociological perspectives on the productive management of reproductive time. That is increasingly, I would argue, women and men are being reminded continuously that they have to manage appropriately their reproductive time. With that, also notions of being prepared for a possible reproductive future that is difficult. And in doing that, also sort of risk managing their reproductive lives in different ways, such as through ways of health, but also perhaps through cryopreservation. And then I think there's a lot to be said for looking at more affective, post-structuralist feminist scholarship that deals with the affects of hope and happiness and anticipation. So my sort of way of working with the field of reproduction within the overall sort of like area of medical humanities is very much of a feminist cultural studies perspective that moves and sort of is built upon these sorts of perspectives and theoretical framework that you're seeing in front of you, as well as, of course, many others. So this is what we're going to have with us when I move into talking a bit about the work that I've done. And also keep in mind that the work that I've done sort of borrows from both more anthropological scholarship, that is work that involves various kinds of extensive interview studies, field work at different clinics, as well as always as a cultural studies scholar being interested in the ways in which these things are being marketed, mediated, and consumed by individual women and men. So one of the sort of key analytical constructs that I typically work with is the idea of imaginaries. And of course, imaginaries can be very aesthetic imaginaries that we're seeing here. The New Yorker front page came about a few years ago now, but of course sort of played on the Demi Moore aesthetics that you might remember, some of you, where she's standing with her naked, very pregnant body, and here sort of bringing about concerns, aesthetics of reproductive motherhood at the age of 40 plus, 50 plus, etc. So when I look at the notion of imaginary, I look at both the discursive aspects of it, how imaginaries are being constituted in language or in rhetoric, but also in the material practices and in the various sort of aesthetic practices that we're seeing here. So I would say that imaginaries highlight the ways in which discursive and material practices are connected to technological developments. And the technological developments in my case involve the issue and the possibility to freeze one's own reproductive cells for often own later use. So these kinds of technological developments, how do they shape our understanding of reproduction? How do they move, or how do they perhaps reinstate normative understandings of reproductive lives? Taking this more feminist critical perspective with me as well. And I would argue that imaginaries are almost always constituted and sort of situated within notions of the good life, within notions of the good / right way of living. So within quite normative understandings of being as well. So the reproductive imaginaries that we'll talk about today sort of evolve around 3 different settings that I've looked at. They involve the marketplace. So what kinds of reproductive imaginaries are at stake in the marketplace in the case of being fertile forever, or in the case of egg and sperm freezing? They also involve law, and in particular, because I come from the Danish context, they involve Danish law. One of my colleagues, who's a lawyer, often says that when we think about law, we tend to forget that this is also a text. So the law is in many ways, we can, from this kind of more feminist cultural studies perspective, view as a text and perhaps even as a type of fiction. That is, laws are also created and constituted through various kinds of legal practices and commentaries. And then we'll look at the reproductive consumers that I call them, and that will be based on an interview study with women that have chosen to freeze their eggs in the United States. So we'll kind of move between the US, Scandinavia, Denmark in particular, back to the study I did with Catherine Carroll in the US. So again, reproductive imaginaries in these 3 different settings, thinking about them as projecting what is good and desirable. But let's begin with the marketplace. Perhaps I could begin with an interview excerpt with David Keefe, who's head of the NYU Fertility Center, and where I did quite a bit of my own field work and interviews with women in New York University Fertility Center. But what he said was, we've been successful at liberating women from pregnancies, but we've never been successful at letting women have children when they want them. And this sort of perspective is quite present or quite common within the marketplace. That is thinking of the idea of freezing one's eggs or sperm as sort of a freedom, autonomy type of narrative or imaginary. So women free themselves of the limitations of gender or age by freezing their eggs is sort of the imaginary that takes place. Of course, this is a very expensive practice as well. So it's also a very attractive business opportunity for Keith as well as other fertility centers in the US as well as elsewhere. So similarly in the sort of aesthetic representations of various fertility clinics, we see this sort of idea that egg freezing becomes a way of taking control of one's fertility. It becomes a way of sort of enacting a form of freedom and even becoming in this way sort of a modern woman. Gone are the more critical perspectives that might highlight or might question who this technology is for, who can afford this technology, why do women need to have this technology, why are they not having children at the time where they might want to have children? Why do they postpone, et cetera? Sort of more structural limitations and criticism that might be posed. But here, of course, you might be tempted to say it's a more sort of freedom perspective and imaginary that is being told. I've started to become more interested in the ways that men also become reproductive consumers and become hailed as reproductive consumers in the US marketplace. Here we see a man sitting, perhaps a cisgendered man sitting with the text, "Parenthood starts with you. Fertility is personal, so understanding, improving, and protecting yours begins with where you're most comfortable at home." The business legacy is based in Switzerland, and it has various options for men in Europe and elsewhere to freeze their sperm and send it to the business for their reproductive cells to be preserved in Switzerland. They're not the only business doing this. Daddy, for instance, is a US-based business that is similarly doing it. Here, saying the easiest way to store and test your sperm, where you can then order your kit, sort of like conveniently situated here in this case in the bedroom, or here where you can read more about how it all works, sort of an overview of the concern about reproductive futures, plastics and fertility, seasonal concerns, weddings and fertility in the case of the pandemic, arthritis and fertility. So various kinds of health-related issues that are being tied to fertility. And it's kind of interesting, the fact is that COVID-19 actually, and whether or not it was the pandemic or if it was something else, has led to an increase in both egg and sperm freezing. So whether it is the concern about future fertility in the face of pandemics, or if it is the very real fact that it might be difficult to meet someone during a pandemic, or what it is, the clinics that I have worked with all report a significant increase in preservation cases throughout the last 2 years. But from a cultural studies perspective, we might say, what kinds of reproductive imaginaries do these sorts of visual and discursive representations seem to sort of bring about? Now, I think certainly it brings about an imaginary reproductive vulnerability. This is perhaps especially interesting in the case of the sperm-oriented agencies and businesses, because reproductive vulnerability has often not been a concern expressed amongst men, and especially not young men, but it's increasingly being introduced here as well. reproductive vulnerability in the case of women become very intimately tied to sort of an idea of a biological clock that is strongly ticking, and women feel at the onset vulnerable in regards to their ability to reproduce. Now, the answer in the marketplace is, of course, consumption. It's sort of the idea of a responsible reproductive citizen today takes actions and chooses to store or preserve her or his reproductive cells. So it is on the websites and in the marketing material of the clinics very much of a liberation narrative or imaginary that this kind of fertility preservation seems to entangle with or seems to play with. Thus, sort of the construction of a reproductive citizen that is responsible, in part because the individual is anticipating the possibility of infertility in the future. So I think at least these four imaginaries are at play in the marketplace and the ways in which fertility preservation and the idea of being fertile forever is being presented. And of course, perhaps we can in the discussion look at them a bit more and also criticize them and develop a critique in regards to these imaginaries. But let's very quickly look at the notion of the law. And here, the question might be what imaginaries are at play when politicians and ethical councils debate cryotechnological and market developments. For example, why does frozen Danish sperm get to travel the world while Danish eggs get to stay at home, so to speak? I mean, here what I'm referring to is a long history of Danish sperm as being sort of marketed throughout Europe and in the United States as first as Viking sperm, and then later on as sperm that came from sort of attractive Danish men that were also sort of well-educated, outdoor lifestyle, sort of drawing upon all of the kinds of stereotypes that might be conventional imaginaries involving Scandinavian men. Some of you might know Cryos International. That really was the agency and the business that used this kind of Viking imagery and advocated for the idea of sperm donors for both heterosexual, lesbian couples and single women. Now, the Danish law has enabled Danish sperm to be exported from the let-go. But until quite recently, it was not possible for a woman to take her own eggs, have them taken out, take her own eggs to a clinic abroad. So there was a clear difference in the law between eggs must stay home, sperm has become an export commodity. And of course, you can discuss, what is behind these kinds of reasons. I would say that certainly gendered imaginaries of Viking sperm traveling sort of quote unquote naturally the world is at play when sperm gets to become an export commodity and eggs have to be protected and have to stay at home. This law has changed, and so now it's possible for Danish eggs to sort of leave the country if you want. So the law has changed on that, but some things have not. So we might, from the get-go say that when you're looking at welfare states such as Denmark, reproduction has historically been important. And it has become, it has been a really key part of the welfare states. As far as fertility preservation is concerned, currently there's an upper age limit for women, which means that women can enter treatment at until the age of 40 in the public sector and until the end of their 45th birthday in the private sector. There are no age limits on men. So if you're an 80-year-old man who so happens to be with a woman who's 39 years old, you can go into the public system and have fertility treatments. But you are not able to do that if you're a 46-year-old woman who wants to go into fertility treatment, it is simply illegal to treat women that are over the age of 45. So there's a clear difference there. Now, the imaginary, so we sort of looked at looking at the discussions in Parliament, as well as in the Bioethical Council, was very clear. It was in part the idea that technologies can be dangerous. So the idea of freezing for later is a technology that has to be tamed. It went from an imaginary in which doctors were trusted to make their best decisions to an imaginary of technologies to be tamed. Also a very clear sort of gendered imaginary involving the appropriate age of motherhood. So there are several in popular discourses, several examples of old men having children late in life, you know, sort of a second round of children being way past the age of 50 that are kind of celebrated, you know, sort of like with photos of sitting in a sports car, hair is kind of like blown, and here he comes with his new child, right? Now, at the same time, at the very same time period, you have these very monstrous constructions of women that are just past 45 that are becoming mothers for the second or third time. So there are very clear distinctions and very gendered imaginaries involving the appropriate age of motherhood. And motherhood is being very much as disciplined and regulated when fatherhood is not. And this is in spite of the fact that the best interest of the child seems to be an imaginary that sort of runs through the legal discourses as well. And of course, this is a very sort of normative imaginary often, as it's used to sort of discipline and reprimand often women in their reproductive lives. So in the law, we have these various imaginaries that try, I would say, to sort of control technological developments. They also try to restabilize and reinstall reproductive timeliness within this gendered framework or imaginary of women's so-called natural time for childbearing. So just one more example, in Denmark currently, if you want to freeze your eggs, you can freeze them for 5 years, right? Then you have two options. You can use them. You have three options. You can use them. You can thaw them, that is throw them out, or you can go to Sweden with a small cryo container and put them into an egg bank in Sweden and have them stored there for another set of 5 years. As far as sperm preservation is concerned, you can freeze your sperm forever. You can even, in your will, I mean, if you die, you can send off your sperm to an ex, to whomever, an old colleague you always had a crush on that you thought, if only, you know, whatever, you can do whatever you want with your sperm. You can basically just kind of will it away for someone else in the future. And this kind of difference, I think, does sort of draw on gendered imaginaries on men being fertile forever, but women being fertile during a very, I mean, fairly narrow time in their lives. And after this sort of quote unquote natural childbearing age, women are supposed to do something different, something else. And so it's an interesting sort of legal discrepancy between women and men in regards to this. Okay, so let's look at the reproductive consumers. And here I'm going to draw on interview studies in the United States that I did together with Catherine Carroll, who's currently at Australia National University in Canberra in Australia. And we interviewed women who had chosen to freeze their eggs. And the interview study here that I'm referring to draws on 16 interviews. So we found several imaginaries, but I want to point to two in particular. One was that I actually was surprised about, which I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised nevertheless, was that this was a very normative story. I mean, this was not the women chose to freeze their eggs for their own later use. This was really women that wanted to find a heterosexual partnership that they wanted to have a marriage family with. And so this was a way of sort of banking on what we might call compulsory coupledom. I mean, the idea of becoming a parent in the future. And it was certainly also the idea of banking on an own child. So not surprisingly, there were also, or perhaps not surprisingly, there were also stories of potential prospective grandparents paying for this procedure because of the idea of being able to have an own grandchild later on in life. So let's look at a few of the excerpts and I can discuss them a bit here. So banking on anticipated coupledom, here's an example from what I've called Leah. I think for me, it was also this long-term relationship and I wanted to be married. It was my own personal preference. I wanted to be married before I had a baby because I felt if you couldn't make that commitment to me, then you can't make the commitment to have that's a bigger commitment to have a baby than to have a marriage. So sort of very much the idea of the heterosexual couple idea and anticipation, desire for that. Lee said, my goal would still be to find someone who had similar moral, ethical, and religious views and to build a relationship. I guess that part I thought about is at what point in a relationship do you say to someone, hey, guess what? I've got some eggs frozen. It was actually interesting in interviewing these women that having the eggs frozen were almost seen as sort of an asset, a dating asset, that you had the foresight to freeze your eggs. So even if you were now 40 or 42, you met someone, you could still say, well, we can still have children because when I was 38, I froze my eggs. So it almost became within an imaginary of a dating asset of sorts for some of these women, at least. And let's see. I think here, this last one before we go on to the next one. Leslie says, I don't settle. I've dated different people and I just think I see my friends that are, well, I'm getting to a point where I have to have kids, so I have to. But I don't at least have to, because I have 32-year-old eggs that are better than 38-year-old eggs. Some people I've been some friends that have settled to get married just to have kids instead of sticking it out and trying to find the right person. This is a very typical interview, really, this idea of not wanting to settle for just anyone, but wanting to have this right person to settle with, and then having the eggs that might be make it possible to have children. And it's not that these individuals are naive in terms of it being a foolproof insurance policy of sorts. They're aware of it being uncertain, but nevertheless, they see it as a possibility and as an option. So the last one here comes from one of the fertility clinics, which is called Extend Fertility, where they say that egg freezing allows a young woman to make choices for herself, whether those choices are to focus on her career, pursue higher education, travel, date without pressure, or any other activity that doesn't involve having babies right now, while preserving the option to have children when she's good and ready. So again, this idea of being able to have a child in your temporality and not the biotemporality that perhaps the so-called biological clock seems to stipulate for you. Okay. So here are a few sort of concluding thoughts, and then I think we'll open up for discussions and see if you have some questions. I mean, very much so, I want to say that technological developments are not surprisingly probably always sort of entangled with or embedded within norms, discourses, metaphors that are cultural experiences and narratives. So when we understand reproduction on ice, or the ability to preserve fertility, it has to be understood within this cultural narrative that is also a very gendered narrative, I would say. And it's gendered in the sense that it provides different avenues and is sort of brought about differently at times for women and for men. And in that sense, it's also sort of a narrative that's interesting to look at from these kinds of feminist and cultural studies perspectives. So I think that's about it for now. Thank you very much. And I'll go off from my share and then see if there are any kind of questions from any of you.